My name is Eldridge Tumbleton, and at 67 years old, I live alone in a two-story house on the outskirts of Gaithersburg, a town that has grown so much in recent years that my once quiet street is now considered almost central. Widower is a word that stuck with me 5 years ago when Dorothy passed away. 5 years is long enough to get used to sleeping on one side of a double bed, cooking for one and talking to the TV instead of my wife. Every morning starts the same: coffee, peanut butter and toast, the newspaper, and a glance at Dorothy's photo on the mantelpiece. Today was no exception, except that I put the newspaper aside more quickly than usual. The local news was irritatingly vacuous: more praise for the mayor, whom I consider a pompous ass, and an article about the renovation of the city park, which has been going on for 3 years now. "See, Dot," I said to the photo, "they still can't lay the tiles on the main path. Remember how we used to walk there every Sunday?" Of course there was no answer, but that doesn't stop me from talking to her. The doctor says it's normal as long as I understand that she won't answer. I think he's wrong. Dorothy does answer, just not with words, but with something inside me that remains from our life together. After breakfast, I went about my usual business. I checked the mailbox where there was nothing but bills and advertisements, watered the cacti on the windowsill, the only plants that survive under my care, and sat down to do the crossword puzzle. It was a day like any other, unremarkable. The doorbell rang around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I wasn't expecting any visitors, so I was a little taken aback. The postman usually comes in the morning, and my neighbors had long since stopped dropping by, unannounced. Standing on the doorstep was my son Lloyd, a tall, thin man of 32 who had inherited his mother's soft chin and uncertain smile. Next to him was a girl, a slender brunette with perfect posture and attentive eyes. "Hi, Dad, can we come in?" Lloyd asked, even though he was already stepping over the threshold. I stepped back silently, letting them into the house. My son and I hadn't seen each other in almost 3 months, even though he lived only 20 minutes away. After Dorothy's death, our relationship, which had never been particularly warm, had become even more strained. He blamed me for not insisting on an earlier diagnosis of her illness, and I blamed him for rarely visiting his mother in her final months. Neither of us spoke about it, but the accusations hung between us like an invisible wall. "Meet Brianna," Lloyd said, putting his arm around her shoulders with a pride I had never seen in him before. "Brianna Shirley," she said, extending her perfectly manicured hand. "It's very nice to meet you, Mr. Tumbleton. Lloyd has told me so much about you." Her handshake was firm and confident, like someone who was used to making an impression. Her voice was melodious, with a slight huskiness that probably seemed sexy to many men. She was about 30, maybe a little younger, well-groomed, stylish, but not pretentious. Her gray-sheathed dress accentuated her figure but was modest enough for a visit to her boyfriend's elderly father. "Come into the kitchen," I said, turning my back to them. "Tea? Coffee?" "Tea would be wonderful," Brianna replied. While I fiddled with the kettle, they sat down at the kitchen table. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Brianna looking around the room, not with curiosity, but rather with an appraising eye, like a real estate agent estimating the value of a property. "You have a very cozy home, Mr. Tumbleton," she said. "So many interesting things. That sideboard looks antique." "It's just a sideboard," I muttered, even though I knew she was right. The sideboard had come from Dorothy's parents, and had cost a decent amount of money, but I didn't like strangers showing interest in our things. "Dad, we have some news," Lloyd said, visibly nervous, drumming his fingers on the tabletop. "Brianna and I, well, we've decided to get married." The teapot in my hand froze halfway to the cups. I turned slowly. "Married? How long have you known each other? A month?" 3 months, Dad," Lloyd blushed. "But when you meet the right person, time doesn't matter." Brianna gently squeezed his hand and gave him a look full of adoration, so full that I almost threw up. "We understand that this may seem rushed," she said softly, turning to me. "But we're both sure of our feelings. Sometimes you just know it's meant to be." I put the kettle on and sat down opposite them, watching the couple. My son, who had always been insecure, was now beaming with happiness, and the girl, there was something about her that made me wary. Maybe it was her perfect smile or the way she held herself as if she were constantly on stage. "What do you do, Brianna?" I asked, pouring tea into the cups. "I work at a travel agency," she replied enthusiastically. "I help people organize their dream trips. It's so inspiring to see other people's dreams come true." Too rehearsed. I'd been a postal inspector all my life, and one of my skills was recognizing insincerity. People who describe their jobs with such drama are usually either newbies or liars. "Where exactly is your agency located?" "In the city center, on Maple Street," she said, taking a sip of tea. "It's a small office, but we have a great team. By the way, this tea is delicious." I nodded, accepting the compliment, but in my mind I was already going over the stores on Maple Street. There was definitely no travel agency there. A flower shop, a bakery, a wine boutique, and a hair salon. Maybe it had just opened recently? "How did you two meet?" I continued my interrogation. "At a coffee shop near my work," Lloyd interjected. "I spilled coffee on my documents and Brianna helped me save them. Classic, right? Too classic. Just like in the romantic comedies Dorothy loves so much. What about your parents, Brianna? Do they know about the engagement?" A slight shadow crossed her face. "Unfortunately, my parents died in a car accident 5 years ago." Her voice faltered with a perfectly calculated tremor. "I only have distant relatives left and we're not very close." "I'm sorry," I said automatically, although something inside me told me not to believe her. Dorothy always said I had a special lie detector. She called it intuition. I called it experience. When you spend years checking your email for scams, you start to notice certain patterns. And right now, my detector was flashing red. "We're planning the wedding in 2 months," Lloyd announced happily. "Nothing grand, but a beautiful ceremony and reception." 2 months. I couldn't hide my surprise. "It usually takes longer to plan." "I have a wedding planner, I know," Brianna smiled. "Olivia is a magician. She can organize everything in no time." I nodded silently, watching them exchange loving glances. Lloyd had always been vulnerable, a sensitive boy who trusted people too easily. After divorcing his first wife 3 years ago, he withdrew into himself, immersed himself in his work at the tax office, and seemed to have lost interest in relationships. And now here he was, sitting in front of me, holding the hand of a girl he had known for only 3 months, talking about marriage. Something didn't add up. "That's a beautiful ring," I remarked, looking at Brianna's hand. A large diamond in a platinum setting sparkled on her ring finger. "Thank you," she smiled even wider. Lloyd picked out exactly what I wanted. I looked at my son with poorly concealed surprise. His salary as a tax inspector hardly allowed for such an expense. The ring looked expensive, at least $6,000. "I saved up for it," he muttered, embarrassed, catching my eye. The conversation flowed on. Plans for the future, discussion of the ceremony, enthusiastic stories about how wonderful their time together was. I listened more than I spoke, watching the couple. Something about Brianna's behavior seemed rehearsed. It was as if she was playing the role of the perfect bride, knowing all her lines by heart. When they left, I stood at the window for a long time, watching them get into the car. Brianna was talking animatedly, gesturing wildly, while Lloyd looked at her with the adoration that only first love or a very good actress can inspire. That evening, I sat in my favorite chair looking at a photograph of Dorothy. "What do you think, Dot?" I asked the silent picture. "The girl seems fake, or am I just becoming a suspicious old man? Dorothy always told me to trust my intuition." "Your nose smells trouble before it happens," she laughed. And right now my nose was definitely smelling trouble. 3 months of dating, an expensive ring, perfect answers to every question, a non-existent travel agency on Maple Street, dead parents and no family. Too convenient. I rubbed my temples, trying to quell the growing headache. Maybe I really am turning into a suspicious old man who sees a conspiracy in every new person. Maybe the girl really loves my son and I'm just jealous of their happiness, sitting alone in an empty house with a photo of my dead wife. But the inner voice, the one Dorothy called intuition, whispered, "Check her out. Something's not right here." I turned off the lights and went up to my bedroom. Tomorrow I would start gathering information about the mysterious Brianna Shirley. Not because I wanted to destroy my son's happiness, but because my intuition had never failed me, and now it was screaming that this girl with the perfect smile and the non-existent travel agency was not who she claimed to be. As I fell asleep, I heard Dorothy's words again. "Trust your instincts, Eldridge. They are stronger than logic and smarter than reason." And I decided to listen to my wife, as I had done for the last 40 years of our life together. The week after Lloyd and Brianna's visit dragged on slowly. I found myself constantly thinking back to their engagement, replaying the details of our conversation in my head. Every morning, instead of my usual crossword puzzle, I opened the city newspaper to the classifieds and looked for travel agencies. Nothing on Maple Street. I even took the bus downtown and walked down the street. As I expected, there was no travel agency. On Friday, the phone rang. Lloyd invited me to dinner at their house to discuss the details of the upcoming wedding. I agreed, suppressing the urge to ask about his fiancée's non-existent job. There would be time for that later. Lloyd's apartment was in a new high-rise complex in the northern part of town. I had been there a couple of times after his divorce, when he had just moved in. Back then, it was a typical bachelor pad, minimal furniture, a half-empty refrigerator, and stacks of work documents on the kitchen table. Now I hardly recognized the place. There was a new sofa with decorative pillows in the living room, stylishly framed paintings on the walls, and a vase of fresh flowers on the coffee table. Everything was decorated in muted beige and blue tones, which had never been my son's taste. "Do you like how we redecorated the apartment?" Brianna greeted me at the door, dressed in a casual but elegant dress. I wanted to create a cozy family nest. "We" and "family" sounded a bit premature, considering they had only known each other for 3.5 months. And judging by the new furniture, Brianna had already moved in with him, although Lloyd hadn't mentioned it. "It looks different," I replied diplomatically, taking off my jacket. Lloyd peeked out of the kitchen, waved a spatula at me, and disappeared again, apparently preparing dinner. Another change was that he used to reheat frozen meals or order delivery. "Your son turned out to be a real chef," Brianna winked at me as she showed me into the living room. "He hid his talents from me for the first few weeks, but now he spoils me every night. Tonight he's making lasagna from a special recipe." I nodded, noting to myself that Lloyd had never shown any interest in cooking. Dorothy had tried to teach him the basics before college, but he had resisted, and now, all of a sudden, he was a real cook. It was nothing short of a miracle. We sat down at the table, which was set with new, intricately patterned dishes. Lloyd served the lasagna, which, I must admit, looked and smelled delicious. "To our future family," Lloyd said, raising his wine glass. I took a sip, still feeling like a guest in a parallel universe where my son had suddenly become a different person. "So, we wanted to discuss the wedding with you," Brianna said, cutting off a small piece of lasagna and elegantly placing it in her mouth. "We already have a clear idea of what we want it to be." 2 months isn't too short to prepare?" I asked, trying the food. "With Olivia Plummer, that's not a problem," Brianna assured me. "She's an international wedding planner. She's usually booked a year in advance, but she made an exception for me. We're old friends." "Old friends?" I raised an eyebrow. You said you didn't have many close friends after your parents died. A slight shadow crossed Brianna's face, but she instantly regained her smile. Olivia is one of the few people who stayed by my side during the hard times. She's like a sister to me. I nodded, making a mental note. Another detail that hadn't come up when we first met. How do you envision the celebration? I asked, glancing at her son. Lloyd opened his mouth, but Brianna answered first. An elegant ceremony at the Grand Oasis. It's the best wedding venue in the area. 150 guests, live music, a buffet, and dancing until dawn. Olivia has already reserved the date, the first Saturday of next month. 150 guests? I almost choked on my wine. Lloyd has 20 friends at most, including his colleagues. And you, if I understand correctly, have almost no family. I have a lot of friends at work and former clients who I've become close with, Brianna replied casually. Besides, a wedding is the only day you can feel like a real princess. Every girl dreams of it since she's a little girl. I noticed Lloyd looking at her adoringly. My ex-daughter-in-law, Ashley, was a practical girl who preferred to spend her money on a down payment for an apartment rather than a lavish wedding. They got married at City Hall and had a modest dinner for their closest relatives. The marriage lasted 4 years, which isn't too bad these days. And how much will this celebration cost? I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. $45,000, Brianna replied calmly, as if she were talking about the price of a cup of coffee. But Olivia gave us a discount. Usually, weddings like this cost at least $60,000. I choked a second time. $45,000. You could buy a decent car or make a down payment on a house for that kind of money. Where did a tax inspector and an employee of a non-existent travel agency get that kind of money? That's an impressive amount, I said cautiously.
We understand.
Brianna said, gently placing her hand on Lloyd's shoulder.
And that's exactly what we wanted to talk to you about.
I tensed, sensing where the conversation was going. You see, Mr. Tumbleton, she continued, looking me straight in the eye. Usually the bride's father pays for the wedding, but since my parents are deceased and Lloyd is currently experiencing financial difficulties after buying the ring, you want me to pay for your wedding? I asked bluntly, putting down my fork. Not all of it, of course, Lloyd quickly interjected. We put down a deposit of $5,000. Only 40 left. Only, as if 40,000 was pocket change you could find in an old jacket. Son, I tried to speak calmly. You know I live on my pension. I have savings, but they're set aside for medical expenses. At my age, it's necessary. You have a whole house, Dad. Lloyd looked at his plate, avoiding my gaze. And I know about the insurance policy Mom took out. It was a blow below the belt. The insurance payout after Dorothy's death was indeed substantial, but it was all I had left of my wife, except for my memories. I'd be happy to help you with the down payment on the house, I replied, but $40,000 for a one-day celebration, that's an unreasonable expense. Mr. Tumbleton, Brianna leaned forward slightly, her voice softening, almost intimate. I understand your reservations. But a wedding isn't just a party. It's a symbolic start to a new family, a moment that will be remembered for a lifetime. Don't you want this day to be special for your son? Pure manipulation. I've seen enough of these tricks in my life. I want my son to be happy, I replied firmly. But happiness isn't measured by the cost of a wedding cake or the number of guests. Dad, please. Lloyd finally looked up. This is important to us. To me. Something in his gaze made me pause. That pleading look, I had seen it before, when he was a teenager and asked for money for the latest fad without which life had no meaning. Back then, it was usually a desire to impress his peers or a girl. Now he looked the same, as if his self-esteem depended on my decision. I need to think about it, I finally said. It's a lot of money and a big decision. Of course, Brianna smiled understandingly, although I noticed a hint of disappointment in her eyes. We all understand, right, honey? Lloyd nodded, but I could tell he was upset. The rest of the dinner was tense.
Brianna tried to lighten the mood by talking about the weather and local news, but there was an unspoken tension between us. As I was about to leave, Brianna suddenly remembered. "Oh, I almost forgot. Olivia wanted to meet with you to discuss the details. She'll be at the Morning Sun Cafe tomorrow at 10. Can you make it? Lloyd and I are working, unfortunately." I agreed, deciding it was a good chance to learn more about the mysterious wedding planner and her international connections. The next morning, I arrived at the cafe 10 minutes early. Morning Dawn was a new place in the city center with a pretentious French chic vibe. Wrought iron chairs, marble tabletops, and overpriced coffee. At exactly 10 o'clock, a woman entered the cafe whom I immediately identified as Olivia Plummer. She was a tall blonde with perfect posture, wearing an impeccably tailored ivory pantsuit. She scanned the room, noticed me, and headed toward my table, exuding confidence and professionalism. "Mr. Tumbleton, Olivia Plummer, wedding planner," she said, extending her hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you." Her grip was as firm as Brianna's, an interesting coincidence. "Likewise," I replied, gesturing for her to sit down. Olivia took a tablet and a leather folder out of her bag.
Brianna told me about your conversation yesterday.
She began without preamble.
I understand your concerns. 45,000 seems like a lot, but I assure you, for a wedding of this caliber, it's a very competitive price.
She opened the folder showing photos of lavish weddings, flower arches, crystal chandeliers, multi-tiered cakes. "The Grand Oasis is the best venue within 100 miles, she continued, "and I only work with trusted, top-notch vendors. The flowers are imported from Holland. The chef has a Michelin star." "Miss Plummer," I interrupted, "have you known Brianna for a long time?" The question clearly caught her off guard. She hesitated for a second, but quickly regained her professional smile. "We've known each other for several years. We met at a mutual friend's wedding where I was the planner." "And what weddings have you planned in our city?" I continued. "Oh, I work all over the East Coast," she said, making a vague gesture with her hand. "This will be my first wedding in Gaithersburg, but I've organized events in Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, and where is your office located?" "In New York," she smiled again, "but I often work remotely, meeting with clients on their turf. It's convenient, no way to check." "And what kind of deposit do you require to get started?" I asked, pretending to be leaning toward a positive decision. "We've already paid 5,000, Olivia replied, switching to a business tone. "The next payment, 15,000, is due in a week to reserve the Grand Oasis and prepay the suppliers. The rest is due 2 weeks before the ceremony." 15,000 in a week, I repeated, making a note in my notebook. "And who should I make the check out to?" "Cash would be preferable," she replied quickly. "Or a bank transfer to my company account. I have the details. Cash, of course. No traces." We spent another hour or so discussing the details of the wedding, the menu, the music, the seating arrangements. Olivia was well prepared and answered all my questions without hesitation. If it weren't for my innate suspicion, I might have believed in her professionalism. When we were done, I offered to pay for her coffee. Olivia agreed but insisted on waiting for me at the exit. She had to answer an important call. As I paid at the counter, I noticed Olivia talking on the phone outside through the glass door. Judging by her gestures and facial expressions, the conversation was emotional and not at all businesslike. I slowly moved toward the exit, trying to hear something. "He almost bought it," I heard as I approached the door. "Yes, 15 next week. Don't worry, Bree. The old man will cough up the cash." Bree, short for Brianna, not client or Miss Shirley, just Bree, the way you call someone close to you. And the old man will cough up, not the most professional expression for talking about a client. When I pushed the door open, Olivia instantly changed her tone and posture, ending the conversation with a formal, "Goodbye, Mrs. Johnson, I'll be sure to pass on your wishes." "Sorry, important client," she smiled at me. Thanks for the coffee, Mr. Tumbleton. So we're set for next Friday to transfer the deposit. Yes, I think I'll have everything sorted out with the bank by then, I lied. We said goodbye and I headed for the bus stop, but after walking a block, I turned around. Olivia was still standing outside the cafe talking on the phone again. A minute later, a taxi pulled up and she drove away. Instead of going home, I decided to walk to the Grand Oasis, the wedding venue Olivia had raved about. It was a 20-minute walk away, in a renovated, historic building. I went inside, pretending to look around for a place for a family celebration. The young receptionist behind the desk smiled warmly. "How can I help you?" "I'm interested in the possibility of holding a wedding," I replied. "My daughter is getting married. Your place was recommended to me." "Of course. We have several options for ceremonies. What date are you looking for?" I gave her the date Brianna had mentioned, the first Saturday of next month. The girl checked her computer and shook her head. "Unfortunately, that date is already taken. We don't have many Saturdays available in the next 6 months. Weddings are usually booked a year and a half in advance." "Really?" I feigned disappointment. "But I heard that a wedding planner named Olivia Plummer reserved that date with you." The administrator furrowed her brow. "Olivia Plummer? I don't recall that name among our partners." She said she works all over the East Coast. She organizes international weddings. "Perhaps she works through one of the agencies we partner with," the girl suggested. "But we have a wedding booked for that date, the Kraft Mitchell wedding, and it's being organized by the White Swan Agency." I thanked her for the information and left, feeling the pieces of the puzzle start to fall into place. No travel agency on Maple Street, no reservation at the Grand Oasis, and most likely no international wedding planner. On my way home, I stopped by the public library. I spent the next 2 hours at a computer connected to the internet, trying to find any information about Olivia Plummer, the wedding planner. Nothing. No website. No social media profiles. No mentions in articles about the wedding industry. However, on one of the forums, I found a year-old post from a user in Baltimore who described a suspiciously similar situation. A woman named Olivia Woods presented herself as an exclusive wedding planner, demanded a large cash deposit, and disappeared with the money. I printed out the forum page and hid it in my pocket. My suspicions turned into certainty. Now I had to proceed with caution to gather more evidence before confronting Brianna and trying to open my son's eyes. That evening, I called my old Army buddy Percival Knott, who had worked as a private investigator after leaving the service. Percival was retired now, but he still had his connections and skills. "Eldridge, you old curmudgeon," he greeted me cheerfully.
"I haven't heard your voice in 100 years.
"Percy, I need your help," I said, briefly describing the situation without going into emotional details. "A marriage scam?" he grunted. "Classic. Give me their names and everything you have on them and I'll dig around." I gave him Brianna and Olivia's names, told him about the inconsistencies I'd noticed, and arranged to meet him in a couple of days. After hanging up, I sat down in the chair opposite Dorothy's photo. "What do you think, Dot? Am I being paranoid or is something really wrong here?" It seemed to me that her smile in the photo had widened slightly, as if she approved of my actions. Dorothy had always supported me in protecting my family, even if my methods were unconventional. I took out my notebook and began to draw up a plan for further investigation. I needed to find out more about Brianna's past, trace her connection to Olivia, and possibly find other victims of their scheme. Time was running out. They were expecting $15,000 from me in a week. But I was determined to expose this scam before it destroyed my son's life. Percy didn't let me down. 3 days after our phone call, he showed up at my doorstep with a worn leather folder under his arm. Despite being 70 years old, my Army buddy had retained his military bearing and the keen gaze that always distinguished good scouts. "Your little bird turned out to be a very interesting specimen," he said, settling down at my kitchen table and unfolding the papers.
Brianna Shirley is just one of her names. In Pittsburgh, she was Brianna Miller. In Providence, Brianna Coleman, and her friend, the wedding planner, introduced herself in different cities as Olivia Woods, Olivia Plummer, and Olivia Wright. I sat down opposite him, looking at the printouts of newspaper articles and screenshots of forums that Percy had laid out on the table. A typical scheme, he continued. She finds a lonely man with decent savings or rich relatives, gains his trust, announces their engagement, and extracts money for the wedding of his dreams. As soon as she gets a large sum, she disappears. And how many times have they done this? I've found evidence of at least 4 cases in the last 3 years, Percy said, tapping his finger on the photos of middle-aged men.
This one lost 20,000, this one almost 30. But there were no actual reports to the police, just complaints on forums and a couple of notes in local newspapers. Why didn't anyone go to the police? Shame, Percy shrugged. Who wants to admit they were taken for a ride? Besides, the money was officially given voluntarily, for the wedding. No witnesses, no receipts. It's just one person's word against another's. I sighed, realizing he was right. Men, especially old-timers, rarely admit that they've been cheated in a romantic relationship. There's good news, Percy said, sliding a sheet of paper with contact information toward me. I talked to 2 of the victims. This guy, Fergus Barlow from Providence, is willing to testify against them if it goes to court. He was engaged to Brianna 6 months ago. I took the sheet, mentally thanking Percy for his connections and skills. What are you going to do? He asked, leaning back in his chair. Talk to my son. Show him the evidence. Percy shook his head. People in love are blind, my friend, especially those as soft and trusting as your Lloyd. She'll brainwash him, convince him that you're trying to destroy their happiness out of jealousy or greed. I knew he was right. Lloyd had always been susceptible to manipulation, especially by women. His first wife, for all her faults, was at least honest. What do you suggest? Give them a rope to hang themselves with, Percy grinned. Agree to their terms, but insist on a formal agreement. Tell them you want everything documented, since it's such a large sum. When they refuse or start to evade the issue, you'll have your first argument for your son. The plan was risky but logical. I decided to follow Percy's advice and arranged a meeting with Brianna, Olivia, and Lloyd for the following evening, ostensibly to discuss the details of the wedding finances. The meeting went exactly as Percy had predicted. When I brought up the contract listing all the services and expenses and mentioned that I would like to personally check the Grand Oasis reservation, Olivia became nervous, citing special relationships with the venue and contract confidentiality. Brianna quickly changed the subject to my lack of support for their happiness, while Lloyd looked at me with growing disappointment. Dad, you promised to help, he said, his voice almost pleading, and now you're making demands. I just want everything to be above board, I replied. $40,000 is no small amount. I have a right to know where my money is going. You don't trust me, Brianna said, feigning hurt, her eyes instantly filling with tears. After everything I've told you about my life, about losing my parents, you still treat me like a stranger. Lloyd hugged her, shooting me a disapproving look. Look what you're doing, he hissed. You've reduced Brianna to tears with your suspicion. Olivia, noticing that the situation was getting out of hand, intervened with a professional smile. Mr. Tumbleton, I understand your concerns. Let's do this. I'll prepare a detailed estimate of all the expenses for you. But as for the official contract, we usually work on trust, especially when it comes to such delicate matters as family celebrations. I nodded, pretending to accept her arguments, but inwardly my suspicions were confirmed. The next day I called Lloyd and told him straight out that I would not be financing the wedding. It was a difficult conversation. My son accused me of being heartless, stingy, and wanting to control his life. I refrained from telling him the whole truth about his fiancée. The moment was not right, and I still didn't have enough evidence. "I'm disappointed in you, Dad," he said coldly. "Mom would never do that." The mention of Dorothy hurt, but I kept quiet. The more I argued now, the more he would strengthen his resolve. 3 days later, a courier delivered an envelope with a court summons. Brianna Shirley was suing me for breach of a verbal agreement to finance her wedding in the amount of $40,000, as well as for defamation and attempting to destroy her relationship with Lloyd. Despite the absurdity of the charges, I understood their strategy. Pressure through the courts would force me to either pay to avoid a trial or look like a scoundrel in the eyes of my son and the public. They didn't know they had walked right into my trap. I called Percy, told him about the summons, and we moved on to phase 2 of the plan. While I was preparing for the preliminary hearing, Percy contacted Fergus Barlow and another victim, Tobias Edwards from Baltimore. Both agreed to testify and provided photos and correspondence with Brianna and Olivia. To my surprise, the case was assigned to an expedited docket. Apparently, Brianna had connections in the local court or simply knew how to push the right buttons. The preliminary hearing was scheduled just a week after the lawsuit was filed. In court, I remained calm and confident. My lawyer, Hamish Fitz, an elderly man with a reputation as a meticulous and principled lawyer, did not refute the allegations that I had refused to finance the wedding, but pointed out that there was no evidence of my promise to do so. "A verbal commitment, Your Honor," he said in a measured tone, "must be corroborated by witnesses or other circumstantial evidence. The plaintiff has neither." Brianna sat on the plaintiff's bench, dressed modestly but elegantly in a light gray suit, minimal makeup, her hair pulled back in a simple bun, the perfect image of an aggrieved bride. Lloyd sat next to her, his gaze fixed on me, full of resentment and disappointment. Brianna's lawyer, a young, ambitious man named Randall Stevens, spoke emotionally and forcefully. "Miss Shirley lost her parents in a tragic accident. Mr. Tumbleton knew this and initially agreed to help finance the wedding, as her father would have done had he been alive. And then, because of his personal dislike for his son's bride, he reneged on his word, causing emotional distress to both young people." Judge Malcolm Ashton, a man in his 60s with a penetrating gaze and a reputation as a fair but strict servant of the law, listened carefully to both sides and set the date for the main hearing in 2 weeks. "Given the specific nature of the case and its family character," he said, "I recommend that the parties try to reach an amicable agreement. Family conflicts are best resolved without the intervention of the court." As I left the courtroom, I heard Randall Stevens say to Brianna, "He'll give in. No one wants a public scandal." 2 weeks before the main hearing, Percy, my lawyer, and I prepared a counterclaim based on the evidence we had gathered. Fergus Barlow and Tobias Edwards agreed to testify, providing photographs and documents confirming their interactions with Brianna and Olivia under different names. In addition, Percy dug up information about Brianna's real identity. Her real name was Bridget Sloan, and she had several minor offenses on her record, including fraud and forgery. Olivia turned out to be her cousin, Ora Sloan, with a similar track record. We neatly packaged all this information into a counterclaim for fraud, which was filed 3 days before the main hearing. Copies were sent to everyone involved in the case, including Judge Ashton. The day of the trial was cloudy with drizzling rain that seemed to reflect my mood. I felt no joy at the impending exposure, only bitterness that my son would have to endure public humiliation and disappointment. When I entered the courtroom, Lloyd and Brianna were already sitting there, talking quietly. Lloyd looked tense, Brianna confident, with a slight smile on her lips. Olivia sat behind them in the front row of the public gallery, elegant as always. None of them seemed to know about our counterclaim yet. Judging by their calm demeanor, Brianna's lawyer had not had time or deemed it necessary to inform them of the new turn of events. The hearing began with the usual formalities. Judge Ashton briefly outlined the essence of the original lawsuit, then gave the floor to Brianna's lawyer. Randall Stevens spoke for about 15 minutes, emotionally describing his client's difficult life, the loss of her parents, the lack of family support, and now the opposition of her future father-in-law, who was allegedly trying to destroy her happiness out of inexplicable animosity.
Mr. Tumbleton has broken his promise not only financially, he concluded. He has broken his moral obligation to support his son at an important time in his life. Instead, he is trying to tarnish Miss Shirley's reputation with baseless allegations. When he finished, Judge Ashton nodded and turned to me and my lawyer. "Mr. Fitz, are you ready to present the defendant's case?"
Hamish Fitz rose, leaning on his cane. His gray hair and wrinkled face gave him the appearance of a wise patriarch who had seen every kind of human depravity in his lifetime. "Your Honor," he began, before presenting our position on the original claim, "I would like to draw the court's attention to the counterclaim we filed 3 days ago." Judge Ashton nodded. "Yes, I have reviewed the counterclaim. Given its seriousness and connection to the original case, I think it's best to hear both claims in the same hearing." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Brianna sat up straight, her confidence slightly shaken, and Randall Stevens looked surprised. He probably hadn't had time to study our counterclaim. "Your Honor," Stevens interjected, "we were not properly notified of the contents of the counterclaim. Please, give us time to review it." "Copies were sent to you 3 days ago, in accordance with procedural rules," the judge replied, "but I will give you 10 minutes to consult with your client." While Brianna's lawyer feverishly leafed through the counterclaim documents, I noticed the expression on my son's face change from confidence to confusion. 10 minutes later, the hearing resumed. Judge Ashton addressed the court. "I have reviewed the materials of the counterclaim filed by Mr. Tumbleton against Miss Shirley, and I find the evidence presented to be serious enough to warrant consideration. The essence of the counterclaim boils down to allegations of fraud, forgery, and attempted extortion." The judge picked up the documents and began reading the main points. According to the materials provided, the citizen who identified herself as Brianna Shirley previously used the names Brianna Miller and Brianna Coleman in other cities, where she used a similar scheme to extort money from men under the pretext of organizing a wedding. I looked over at Brianna. She sat frozen, like a statue, her eyes wide with terror. Her face, which usually radiated confidence and charm, was contorted with fear and the realization that the game was over. Attached to the case file are written statements from 2 victims, Fergus Barlow of Providence and Tobias Edwards of Baltimore, the judge continued, who confirmed that they were defrauded in a similar manner by a woman they identified from photographs as the plaintiff. Lloyd slowly turned to Brianna, his face a mixture of disbelief, pain, and dawning understanding. She tried to take his hand, but he pulled away. "Furthermore," the judge's voice became more severe, "the information provided indicates that the Grand Oasis wedding complex, allegedly booked for the ceremony, has no record of the event on the date in question, and wedding planner Olivia Plummer is not listed as a professional wedding planner in the city and has no business registration under that name." Olivia, sitting in the front row, quietly moved closer to the exit. Her face lost all expression, becoming the mask of a professional poker player. "Based on all the documents presented," the judge concluded, "I find Miss Shirley's initial claim to be unfounded and dismiss it. With regard to the counterclaim, I am ordering an additional investigation involving law enforcement agencies to verify the facts of fraud." Silence fell in the courtroom, broken only by the rustling of papers and the quiet sobs of Brianna, who was now portraying remorse and shock at the unfair accusations. I looked at my son, waiting for his reaction. Lloyd sat with his head down, his shoulders slumped. He looked like a man who had just seen his whole world collapse. When the judge announced a recess before continuing with the counterclaim, the courtroom began to stir. Brianna's lawyer was whispering feverishly in her ear. Olivia slipped out unnoticed and disappeared into the hallway. I wanted to go to my son, but he stood up and quickly left the courtroom without looking at me. Percy caught up with me at the exit of the courthouse.
You ruined their scheme, old man,
He said, patting me on the shoulder. They didn't expect such a thorough investigation. I nodded, but I felt no joy. Victory in court probably meant the loss of my relationship with my son, at least for the foreseeable future. What about Brianna? I asked. The bailiffs detained her for further investigation, but her accomplice got away.
But don't worry.
With our evidence, they won't stay free for long. The rain intensified as I left the courthouse. Lloyd was standing on the steps under the canopy, staring blankly ahead. I walked slowly toward him, not knowing what to say. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" he asked without turning around. "You wouldn't have believed me," I replied honestly. "You were too enchanted by her." He nodded, acknowledging the truth of my words. "I feel like such a fool," his voice trembled. "She seemed perfect." "That's their skill," I said, gently placing my hand on his shoulder. "They study you, learn what you want, and become exactly that." Lloyd shook off my hand and turned to me with unexpected anger in his eyes. "And you probably feel good now, don't you?"
Proving that you were right and I was a naive idiot?
"No, son," I shook my head. "It hurts me to see you in pain. I didn't do this to prove I was right. I did it to protect you." "I didn't ask for protection," he almost shouted. "I asked for trust and support. If you had just given me the money I asked for, she would have disappeared with it," I finished. "And you would have been left not only with a broken heart, but also with an empty wallet." Lloyd shook his head, his eyes glistening with tears he was holding back. "You always think you know best. You're always in control. Even now, you can't just sympathize, you have to lecture." He turned and walked away, hunched over in the rain, without looking back. I watched him go, realizing that today's victory in court was also a defeat in my relationship with my son.
Perhaps temporary,
Perhaps permanent. Only time would tell if he would ever forgive me for destroying his illusion of love. The day after the first hearing, I woke up with a heavy heart. The victory in court, which should have brought relief, left a bitter taste. The image of Lloyd walking away in the rain stayed with me all night. The phone rang around 10.
It was Hamish Fitz, my lawyer.
"Eldridge, we have some interesting news," he said enthusiastically. "The police arrested Brianna when she tried to withdraw money from her account and buy a bus ticket to Philadelphia. She offered a deal. She'll admit guilt in exchange for a reduced sentence." "And Olivia?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "She disappeared, as expected.
But now that Brianna is cooperating,
The police have a chance of finding her." I thanked Hamish and hung up. My thoughts returned to my son. I tried calling him several times, but he didn't answer. The trial was scheduled to continue the next day. This time, Fergus Barlow and Tobias Edwards were scheduled to testify, having traveled to Gettysburg to give their statements in person.
before the hearing began, I met them in a small cafe near the courthouse.
Fergus was a thin man in his 50s with sad eyes and prematurely graying temples. Tobias was younger, around 40, with a stocky build and a nervous habit of constantly adjusting his glasses. "I lost $28,000, Fergus said, stirring his cold coffee. "Not just money, but my dignity." My colleagues laughed behind my back. How could I have been so stupid? My sister still brings it up at every opportunity. "I had a similar experience," Tobias nodded. "Plus, she introduced me to her friend Olivia, who was supposedly in real estate. I almost put down a deposit on a house that didn't exist. $35,000.
Listening to their stories, I felt mixed emotions.
Relief that I had saved my son from a similar fate, and bitterness at the realization that he would hardly appreciate my concern. "Are you really going to testify?" I asked. "It will be public. I'll have to go through the humiliation again," Fergus shrugged. It's not so bad after the first time. Besides, if it helps stop them and protect other people, it's worth it.
I feel responsible, added Tobias.
If I had reported it earlier, your son might not have ended up in this situation. Their words made me see things in a new light. It wasn't just my family's personal drama, but part of a larger problem. Scammers preying on people's emotions. When we entered the courtroom, I immediately spotted Lloyd. He was sitting in the back row, tense and pale.
Our eyes met for a moment, but he looked away.
Brianna was brought in under guard. She looked completely different from the previous hearing. No makeup, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, dressed in standard prison attire. But even so, she managed to maintain her poise and dignity. Judge Ashton began the hearing right on time.
After the formal opening, Fergus Barlow was given the floor to testify.
Fergus spoke calmly and to the point, without trying to elicit pity or discredit Brianna beyond the facts. He recounted how he had met her in Providence 8 months earlier, how she had introduced herself as Brianna Miller, a consultant at an art gallery. He recounted how, after 2 months of dating, they became engaged and how soon after, a childhood friend named Olivia Woods appeared on the scene, a talented wedding planner. The pattern was exactly the same, Fergus said, looking out into the courtroom. A lavish wedding in an exclusive location, a large cash deposit required. I paid $28,000. A week later, both Brianna and Olivia disappeared. Their phones were turned off, their social media accounts deleted.
I hired a private investigator, but
he only found a few similar cases in other cities. The police weren't particularly interested. They said it was a civil matter and the money had been given voluntarily. His words were met with silence. I watched Lloyd out of the corner of my eye. He sat motionless, staring ahead. Tobias Edwards was more emotional.
He described how Brianna, who called herself Brianna Coleman at the time,
came into his life after his wife's death and became a ray of light in the dark realm of loneliness for him. She knew all my weaknesses. His voice trembled. She knew what to say, how to behave. It was as if she had read the manual on my personality. When Olivia showed up with an offer to buy us a house at a discount, I almost believed in miracles.
Thank God my brother insisted on checking the documents before paying.
They disappeared the next day. During cross-examination, Brianna's lawyer tried to cast doubt on his client's identity. Maybe it was just a woman who looked like her. Maybe the witnesses were confusing her with someone else. But when the photos were presented, there was no doubt.
The photos taken in Providence and Baltimore clearly showed Brianna,
with different hairstyles and clothing styles, but undoubtedly her. After a break, the floor was given to Percy, who was acting as a private investigator conducting the investigation.
He methodically presented the facts he had gathered.
There was no travel agency on Maple Street where Brianna was supposed to work. There was no reservation at the Grand Oasis. There was no business registration in the name of Olivia Plummer. And finally, the real names of the fraudsters. Bridget and Aura Sloan, cousins with a criminal past.
During the investigation,
Percy concluded, it was established that they had carried out a similar scheme in at least 5 cities over the past 3 years. The total amount of funds stolen exceeds $150,000. Brianna sat with her head down, no longer trying to play the role of the offended innocent. Her lawyer looked confused. Apparently, she had not informed him of all the details of her activities.
When it was time for Brianna to testify, she unexpectedly changed tactics. Instead of denying the obvious, she admitted the facts but tried to portray herself as a victim of circumstances.
Yes, I made mistakes in the past, she said in a trembling voice. But with Lloyd, it was real. I really loved him and wanted to start a new life. I looked at my son.
He leaned forward as if trying to catch every word she said, a glimmer of hope flashing in his eyes.
Olivia convinced me to go through with our scheme one last time, Brianna continued. I agreed because we had already invested money in the organization and couldn't back out. But I was going to break with the past after the wedding and live honestly.
What a convenient lie.
I almost admired her ability to improvise and adapt to circumstances. Brianna was a natural actress.
What about the other men? Asked the prosecutor. Fergus Barlow and Tobias Edwards, did you swear your love to them too? Brianna lowered her eyes. I was a confused woman trying to find my way. Yes, I lied to them, and I regret it. But Lloyd is different. He's special.
I saw my son straighten up in his seat. Even now, after all the evidence, he wanted to believe. After closing arguments and a brief deliberation, Judge Ashton announced his decision. Brianna Shirley, also known as Bridget Sloan, was found guilty of fraud, attempted extortion, and document forgery.
Considering her guilty plea and cooperation with the investigation,
She was sentenced to 2 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 1 year, as well as an obligation to pay compensation to the victims. In addition, the judge added, I order the immediate arrest and search for Aura Sloan, also known as Olivia Plummer, Olivia Woods, and Olivia Wright, as accomplices to the crimes.
Brianna was led out of the courtroom under guard.
Before leaving, she turned and took one last look at Lloyd, a look full of pleading and promise. My son watched her leave with an expression I couldn't read, a mixture of pain, doubt, and, what frightened me most, still lingering affection. After the hearing, I tried to approach Lloyd, but he quickly left the courtroom.
I found him in the parking lot, sitting in his car with the engine off.
Can I come in? I knocked on the window. He hesitated, then nodded. I got into the passenger seat. We sat there in silence for a few minutes. Then Lloyd said quietly, Do you think she was telling the truth? That it was real with me? I could have lied to comfort him. Said yes, of course she really loved him, and their relationship was special.
But there had been enough lies in this story already.
No, son, I said softly. It's her job to make men believe they're special. She said the same thing to Fergus and Tobias, and before them to someone else. Lloyd gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. What's wrong with me, Dad? Why am I so bad at reading people? First Ashley with her cheating, now Brianna.
There's nothing wrong with you, I said, putting my hand on his shoulder.
You're just trusting. You see the best in people. That's not a flaw.
It's a weakness, he said bitterly, a weakness that others take advantage of. We fell silent again. I didn't know what else to say. No words could heal the wound caused by betrayal. I'm going to visit her, Lloyd said suddenly. In prison, I want to hear the truth from her, looking her in the eyes. I held back a sigh. I understood all too well the desire to cling to an illusion. After Dorothy died, I spent months talking to her photograph, waiting for an answer that would never come. It's your decision, I said, but be prepared for the truth to be even more painful than you think. I deserve to know, he replied stubbornly. We agreed to meet the next day for dinner.
When I got out of the car, Lloyd rolled down his window and called out to me,
Dad, thank you for saving me from the worst possible outcome. I nodded, not trusting my voice. It was the first acknowledgement that my actions had value, albeit painful. At home, a call from Percy was waiting for me. Olivia's been found, he said without preamble, at the Boston airport, trying to fly to Mexico.
She had $22,000 in cash with her,
probably their share from previous scams and deposits from new victims. Did she confess? She's trying to negotiate a deal like Brianna. She's offering to turn in the other members of the scheme in exchange for a minimal sentence. The others? I was surprised. There are more than 2? According to her, there are 3 more teams working in different cities using the same scheme. It's like a fraud franchise.
She promises to reveal all the names and details.
I shook my head, amazed at the scale of the scam. How many more gullible men had fallen for this trick? How many families had been affected? The next morning, an article about the wedding scam appeared in the newspaper. A journalist named Patrick Morrow contacted me for an interview, but I declined. This story had already brought enough publicity to my family.
Lloyd called in the afternoon, his voice sounding tired.
Did you see the article?
Yes, I replied. I hope it's not causing too much of a stir at your office. It's been worse, he said after a pause. I requested permission to visit Brianna. They said next week. I didn't comment on his decision. Are you still coming over for dinner tonight? I asked instead. Yes, I'll be there at 7. Over dinner, we talked about everything except Brianna, about Lloyd's work, my garden, our vacation plans. It was as if the last few months had never happened, and we were just a father and son spending an evening together. Only when I walked him to the door did Lloyd suddenly stop and turn to me. I still don't understand how you figured it out. From the very beginning, what made you suspect her? I paused, trying to articulate the intuitive feeling I had had when I first met Brianna.
She was too perfect, I finally said.
She fit what you wanted too well. It was as if she had studied a list of your desires and made them all come true. Lloyd frowned. And that's a bad thing? Finding someone who's right for you? No, but real people aren't perfect. They have rough edges, inconsistencies, contradictions.
Dorothy, for example, was stubborn,
Sometimes quick-tempered, and hated my habit of reading the newspaper at breakfast. But it was those imperfections that made her real. Lloyd looked at me for a long time, then nodded. I know what you mean. Brianna never argued with me. She always agreed, was always in the right mood. That should have made me suspicious. You'll learn to notice things like that. I patted him on the shoulder. With experience.
He smiled faintly and walked out into the night. I watched his car drive away, feeling that the worst was behind us, although the road to full recovery would be long. 2 days later, Hamish Fitz reported that Olivia had agreed to cooperate and had begun to testify against the other participants in the scheme. According to her, she and Brianna had been working together for 4 years, during which time they had defrauded at least 12 men in different cities.
She also claims that Brianna was the initiator and organizer of the scheme, Hamish added. Olivia was allegedly just a pawn, acting under her cousin's direction. They're blaming each other, I muttered. Typical. Either way, they'll both get what they deserve, and thanks to your counterclaim, Eldridge, the other victims will get compensation too. I thought about Hamish's words as I sat in my chair that evening. It wasn't so much about the money, although for some of the victims the sums were significant, as it was about restoring justice and preventing further victims. Dorothy's photograph stared at me from the mantelpiece. I raised my glass of whiskey toward her. You were right, Dot. Intuition really is stronger than logic. Somewhere in the city, Lloyd was probably sitting alone in his renovated apartment, trying to piece together the fragments of his confidence and trust. And in her holding cell, Brianna was probably already thinking about her next role, a remorseful criminal worthy of parole. Olivia disappeared from the radar after her arrest. She was probably transferred to a witness protection program in exchange for testimony. The $22,000 found on her was seized as evidence and was to go to the victims as compensation after all legal proceedings were completed. What began as a simple visit from my son and his fiancée turned into a complex fraud case that affected many lives, and although justice prevailed, the true price of this victory was yet to be determined in my relationship with Lloyd. A week after the trial ended, life returned to a strange semblance of normalcy. I returned to my daily routine of reading the newspaper, tending to the garden, and spending my evenings looking at Dorothy's photograph. On the surface, everything seemed normal, but inside me there was a new sense of uncertainty. Lloyd called only once, to say that he had visited Brianna in the detention center. The conversation was short and tense. How is she? I asked, not knowing what else to say. She's holding up, he replied laconically. She says she was framed, that Olivia was the ringleader and she was just following orders, fearing for her life. I suppressed the urge to remind him of all the evidence presented in court, of the testimony of other victims, of the fact that it was Brianna, not Olivia, who was the link in all the fraud cases. "And you believe her?" I asked instead. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, then a quiet reply. "I don't know. Part of me wants to believe her." After that conversation, Lloyd didn't get in touch for 2 weeks. I tried calling him several times, but he didn't answer. Finally, I decided to visit him in person. Lloyd's apartment looked different from when I had last visited. The decorative pillows and paintings in stylish frames were gone. Instead of a vase of flowers on the coffee table, there were empty takeout containers. The apartment had returned to its bachelor state, but with a hint of desolation and indifference. Lloyd himself had changed too. He had lost weight, had dark circles under his eyes, and a week's worth of stubble adorned his chin. He let me in without enthusiasm, gesturing for me to sit down. "How are you?" I asked, even though the answer was obvious. "Fine," he shrugged.
Working, living.
We sat in awkward silence. I looked around the room, noting all the traces of Brianna's presence that Lloyd had tried to erase. Photos taken down from the walls, leaving light rectangles on the wallpaper. An empty space on the shelf where her books used to be. The absence of women's things that had once been everywhere. "I was worried," I finally said. "You didn't answer your phone." "I was busy," he said, looking away.
Lots of work at the office.
The lie was obvious, but I didn't dwell on it. I thought maybe we could have dinner together, or go to a baseball game on the weekend. The Nationals are playing the Mets. It should be a good game. Lloyd shook his head. "I'm not in the mood for fun." "Then just dinner. I can make your favorite roast, like when you were a kid." He sighed and finally looked me straight in the eye. "Dad, I appreciate your concern. I really do.
But I need some space, time to figure things out."
Of course, I nodded, trying to hide my disappointment. I understand. We talked a little more about the weather, work, the city park renovation that was finally finished. Superficial topics, safe and neutral. When I left, Lloyd promised to call next week. We both knew he wouldn't.
On the way home, I reflected on the strange nature of our family dynamic. Lloyd and I had never been particularly close, even when Dorothy was alive. She was the bridge between us, translating from one language to the other. Without her, we were like two people on opposite banks of a river, with no means of communication. At home, I poured myself a whiskey and sat down in front of my wife's photo. "You would have known what to do, Dot," I said quietly.
You always found the right words.
The next 2 months passed in agonizing anticipation. Lloyd didn't call or respond to my messages, except for the occasional one-word replies. "Fine, busy, talk later." I began to accept that our relationship might never be repaired. One evening, there was a knock at the door. Percy was standing there with a newspaper under his arm and a bottle of whiskey.
"Thought you might need some company," he said as he came in, "and a stiff drink." I led him into the kitchen and got out some glasses. Percy unfolded the newspaper and laid it in front of me. "Did you see today's paper?" I glanced at the headline on page 3. Brianna Shirley, accused of a series of wedding scams, found guilty and sentenced to 3 years in prison. 3 years, I muttered, less than she deserves. Considering her guilty plea and cooperation with the investigation,
"It's not a bad sentence," Percy remarked, pouring himself a whiskey. Her cousin Olivia only got 18 months probation. She turned in all her accomplices, including Brianna. I took a sip from my glass, feeling the alcohol burn my throat. "Does Lloyd know?" "He should if he reads the news," Percy shrugged. "Have you been in touch with him?" "No," I shook my head. "He's been avoiding me."
I think he still blames me for destroying his happiness.
Percy snorted. "A false happiness based on lies. What's the point of that?" "It was real to him," I replied quietly, "while it lasted." We sat in the kitchen for a long time, reminiscing about old times, discussing the news, avoiding the subject of Lloyd and Brianna.
When Percy left, I felt a strange sense of relief,
as if his visit had reminded me that there were other relationships in the world besides my broken connection with my son. The next day, I decided to give it another try. I called Lloyd at work, introduced myself to his colleague, and asked him to tell Lloyd that I would be waiting for him at the Morning Dawn Cafe during his lunch break. I wasn't sure he would come, but I hoped for the best. To my surprise, Lloyd walked into the cafe at exactly 1 p.m. He looked better than when we last saw each other, clean-shaven, wearing a fresh shirt, though still thin and tense. "Hi, Dad," he said, sitting down across from me. "Did something happen?" "Nothing special," I tried to smile. "Just wanted to see you, make sure you're okay." He nodded, absent-mindedly sorting through the sugar packets on the table. "I saw the news," I said cautiously, "about the sentence." "Yes," his face froze. 3 years. It could have been worse. "Are you in touch with her?" Lloyd looked up. "Is that a problem?" "No." I raised my hands in a conciliatory gesture. "I just asked." "Yes, I visit her," he said defiantly, waiting for condemnation. "Once a week, we write to each other." I was silent, searching for words that wouldn't sound like criticism. "She's changed, Dad," Lloyd continued, taking my silence as disapproval. "She's realized her mistakes. She wants to start a new life after she gets out." "I'm happy for her," I said neutrally. "No, you're not," Lloyd said with a bitter smile. "You think she's manipulating me, that I'm falling for the same thing again." "I didn't say that." "You don't have to," he leaned back in his chair. "It's written all over your face. You've always thought I was weak, easily influenced, a mama's boy, incapable of making my own decisions." His words hurt, especially since there was some truth to them. I had always considered Lloyd to be softer than he should have been. Dorothy spoiled him, protected him from any difficulties, and I watched silently, sensing that this would not prepare him for the real world. "I never thought you were weak," I objected. "Just trusting. Those are different things." "Are they?" He shook his head. "You interfered in my life, ruined my relationship, made me look like a fool in front of the whole town. And all because you didn't believe in my ability to figure things out for myself." "Brianna was deceiving you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "She was a professional con artist. The court found that, and she admitted it herself. Because she had no choice." Lloyd raised his voice then, noticing the stares of other patrons, lowered it to a whisper. "Her lawyer said that, with your evidence, there was no chance of winning the case. A guilty plea was the only way to get the minimum sentence." I looked at my son, not recognizing him. The rational, logical Lloyd, who worked with numbers and facts at the tax office, was now denying the obvious, preferring to believe in fantasy. "Lloyd," I leaned forward, "you saw the photos. You heard the other men's testimony. You read the documents. She did this before, repeatedly. This wasn't some mistake or a single moment of weakness." "People can be framed," he replied stubbornly. "Documents can be forged. You yourself said that you constantly dealt with forged letters and statements at the post office." I sighed, realizing the futility of the argument. Lloyd saw what he wanted to see, and no amount of argument could change his perception. "All right," I said, raising my hands in a gesture of surrender. "I won't argue. It's your life, your decisions." "Finally you get it," he said with a bitter smile. We finished lunch in tense silence. When it was time to say goodbye, I tried one more time. "Lloyd, regardless of our differences, you're my son. I love you and want you to be happy. If you ever need help, any kind, just give me a call." He looked at me for a long time, then nodded. "Okay, Dad, thanks for lunch." That was our last meaningful conversation. After that, Lloyd completely cut off all communication. He didn't answer my calls, didn't open the door when I came to his house, and returned 2 letters I sent him unopened. Percy advised me to give him time. Wounds heal, Eldridge, even deep ones.
Once the initial pain subsides, he'll realize you were acting out of the best of intentions. But months passed and the situation remained unchanged. I learned from mutual acquaintances that Lloyd was visiting Brianna regularly in prison, sending her money and even discussing their future together after her release.
He says they're going to get married as soon as she gets out,
Lloyd's neighbor, Mrs. Dobbs, told me when I accidentally ran into her at the supermarket. He plans to move to another city and start over. He says there are too many people here who judge their relationship. I thanked her for the information, even though every word was like a knife in my heart. One evening, almost 6 months after the trial, Percy called me.
"Turn on the TV," he said, instead of saying hello.
"Local news, now." I turned on the TV just in time to see the report. Olivia Plummer, known for her high-profile wedding scam, has been arrested in Colorado while attempting to pull off a similar scheme, despite her suspended sentence. The camera showed Olivia being led out of the building by police officers. She looked as elegant as ever, just a little more tired and irritated. "See?" Percy's voice came through the phone. "These people never change. As soon as they get the chance, they go back to their old tricks." I thought of Brianna, sitting in prison and planning her wedding to my son. Did she really believe what she was telling him? Or was this just a new game? A way to secure support and a place to return to after her release?
You have to show this to Lloyd.
Percy insisted.
It proves that the whole gang are incorrigible crooks.
He won't listen, I replied wearily. He's made his choice. Over the next few months, I tried to come to terms with the loss of my son.
I knew he was physically alive and well,
but emotionally, he was as inaccessible to me as if he were dead. The thought was painful, but I learned to live with it, just as I had learned to live without Dorothy. Winter turned to spring, then summer. I worked in the garden, went fishing with Percy, even signed up for computer classes at the local library. Anything to fill the void in my life.
One day in August,
the doorbell rang. The postman was standing on the doorstep with a registered letter. "Sign here, Mr. Tumbleton," he said, handing me a pad with a form. I signed and took the envelope. The return address was unfamiliar. Some law firm in the city center. Inside the envelope was an official notice. Lloyd was changing his last name from Tumbleton to Sheridan, his mother's maiden name. According to state law, he was required to notify all immediate relatives of his decision. I sat down in a chair, holding the letter in my trembling hands. This was more than just a change of surname. It was a symbolic renunciation of me, of our family, of everything that connected us. That night, for the first time in many years, I drank myself into oblivion. Percy found me the next morning, asleep in the chair, with an empty whiskey bottle on the floor and Dorothy's photo pressed to my chest.
"Get up, you old fool."
He shook me and made me drink some water.
"What's got you so upset?"
I silently handed him the letter. Percy read it, whistled, and shook his head.
"That's cruel. But you know what? Maybe it's for the best. A clean break, no illusions, no false hopes."
There was truth in his words. All these months, somewhere deep down, I had hoped that Lloyd would come to his senses, realize his mistake, and come back. Now that hope was dead, and strangely, it brought relief, like having a bad tooth pulled that had been hurting for a long time, but you had grown accustomed to the pain. In the fall, I received another letter, this time from Brianna's lawyer. She was applying for parole and asked me not to interfere. In exchange, she promised that she and Lloyd would leave town and never bother me again. I didn't respond to the letter. My opinion no longer mattered, not to the justice system, not to my son. In November, while browsing the local newspaper, I came across a small announcement in the marriage section. Lloyd Sheridan and Brianna Shirley are engaged to be married. The wedding will take place in December. No details, no mention of the bride or groom's parents. I cut out the announcement and put it in my desk drawer next to other mementos. Lloyd's birth certificate, his first school drawing, a photo of the three of us with Dorothy on a picnic in the park.
fragments of a past that would never return. In December, on the day of the supposed wedding, I deliberately left town.
I spent the weekend at a small beach hotel, walking along the deserted winter beach and thinking about the strange twists and turns that life takes. I saved my son from financial ruin, from a con artist who saw him only as a source of money. But the price of that salvation was the loss of our relationship. Was it worth it? I didn't know the answer to that question. When I returned home, I found a small cardboard box in my mailbox. Inside was Dorothy's ring, a simple gold wedding band that I had given to Lloyd after her death, telling him it should stay in the family. There was no note, but the message was clear. To Lloyd, I was no longer family. I put the ring on a chain and hung it next to Dorothy's photo on the mantelpiece. "That's it, Dot," I said quietly. "We lost him." In the spring, I received a postcard postmarked Arizona. No signature, just a short phrase.
"We're fine. Don't worry." The handwriting was Lloyd's. That was the last contact we ever had. I didn't try to find their new address, didn't ask Percy to use his connections to find out where they had settled. If my son wanted to start a new life without me, I had to respect his decision, no matter how painful it was. Sometimes on particularly quiet evenings, I wondered if Brianna had really been in love with Lloyd, or if it had just been another role in her repertoire. Had she really changed, or had she simply adapted to her new circumstances, finding a new way to manipulate and control? I hoped, for Lloyd's sake, that she had truly been reborn, that her time in prison had changed her for the better. But deep down, I knew that people rarely change that much, especially those who have spent years perfecting the art of deception. My intuition, which had never failed me in detecting lies, told me that Brianna and Lloyd's story would not have a happy ending. But this time, I kept my suspicions to myself, knowing that sometimes the price of the truth is too high. After all, some lessons everyone has to learn for themselves, through their own experience. I learned mine. Sometimes, in trying to protect those you love, you risk losing them forever. It was a bitter lesson, but I accepted it as I had accepted all the trials in my long life, with dignity and without regret for the choices I had made. One morning, while checking the mail, I saw a small note in the local newspaper. Former con artist Olivia Plummer arrested in Tucson, Arizona, while attempting to pull off a financial scam. My heart sank. Tucson was the city in Arizona where Lloyd's last postcard had come from. I cut out the article and put it in the same box where I kept the engagement announcement. It was another piece of a story that continued without me. Time passed. I grew older, getting used to loneliness and finding a special harmony in it. Every evening, I talked to Dorothy's photograph, telling her about my day and sharing thoughts I couldn't confide in anyone else. "You know, Dot," I said on one such evening, "I don't regret what I did. Even if Lloyd never forgives me, even if I never see him again, I did the right thing. I protected him from a con artist who would have ruined his life sooner or later. Maybe not this time, but the next, or the one after that." Deep down, I believed that someday, perhaps many years from now, Lloyd would understand my motives. He would understand that I acted out of love, not out of a desire to control his life. But even if that didn't happen, I could live with the knowledge that I had done everything I could to protect my son. That was the price of truth in our story. Broken relationships, shattered illusions, bitter lessons. But the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than the most beautiful lie. Life had taught me that, and I had carried that principle through all of its trials. I closed the album with the family photos, turned off the lights, and went up to my bedroom. Tomorrow would be a new day, with its own little joys and sorrows. Life went on, despite everything. And in that was its inexorable, simple wisdom.